Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 23rd of May. Today we will be talking briefly about the situation in the Belgorod region, and we'll be talking about some of its implications. And so that's really it for today, because there haven't been that many updates from the Bakhmut direction, which is really the main part of the front line that I've been discussing for the past 9 months. So I'm going to branch out now, talk about some other parts of the front line. And this is an area that has been ignored so much because honestly there have been really very limited battles between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and very limited amount of artillery duels that have occurred on the border between Russia and Ukraine in areas such as Belgorod Oblast, which is the oblast that I'll be focusing on today. But also, if you go a bit to the north, you have Kursk Oblast, and you also have Bryansk Oblast a bit further to the north, bordering Sumy and Chernihiv. And so again, it's just been cross-border shelling for really the past year, ever since the Russians withdrew from their original phase 1 battle positions, which aimed to take over cities like Chernihiv, Sumy, Okhtyrka, Kharkiv. Ever since then, there's just been cross-border shelling. There have been sometimes Ukrainian raids across the border, but they've been very limited. The last one that happened was in March, and it was also in the Belgorod region. And again, it was conducted by some units within Ukraine that aren't associated with the armed forces of Ukraine officially, but they do have some backdoor connections, and they are conducting certain operations probably on the Ukrainians' behalf, but they have their own reasons for doing it as well. And so most of these units, they are actually Russians that are living in Ukraine that are opposed to Vladimir Putin. And so that's their ideological purpose. And then they're usually stationed along the border with Russia in these areas like Belgorod, and they conduct probing operations, either shelling or actually going into the Russian border with recon. And I want to stress that it's not that hard. You may see a border over here, this white line that separates the Russians and the Ukrainians. But this border is really just an arbitrary line, in all honesty. Because at this point, now that we're in an all-out war, the real thing that defines whether an area is under Russian or Ukrainian control is whether that area is actually physically controlled by a Russian soldier, or if it's within the Russian range of fire on a small scale. And so a lot of these areas that may officially be under Russian control, a lot of them may just be a gray zone because they're just forests or open fields or something. And so it's not that hard for a small Ukrainian force to, whenever they feel like it, cross over the border and just go through some open field and enter a town. It's not that difficult, especially given the fact that there aren't that many Russian border guards that are manning every single square inch of the line. And that's partly due to the fact that they are short on men in this area. It's also due to some incompetence, because honestly, it should have been anticipated that something like this would happen, since this is not the first time that there's been a Ukrainian raid across the border. But nonetheless, we're going to talk about how Russia responded. First, let's talk about the Ukrainian, or actually the Russian formation that conducted this operation in Russia. So, the two units responsible for this probing attack onto the Russian towns in Belgorod Oblast are the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps. And so the Freedom of Russia Legion, it has 2 battalions and about 1,000 men in total. And so it is just consisting of these anti-Putin Russian citizens living in Ukraine, and then something with the Russian Volunteer Corps. And these units, they were actually fighting in Bakhmut, so it's possible that some of them are still on the Bakhmut front, and that some of them were moved or just were always located here on the border with Russia. And so this unit, the Freedom of Russia unit, they claimed yesterday that they had quote-unquote liberated the settlement of Kozinka in Belgorod, and that they were advancing towards the city of Graveron. And so let me show you what the extent of their advances looked like, because now they've been pushed back, obviously, as shown by my map. And so this was really the full extent, this little red bulge that you can see over here. So the Ukrainian forces, which consisted of a couple hundred people, maybe several platoons, took over the town of Kozinka, took over Glatovo, they took over Gora Podol, and then the gray zone really spanned all the way to Graiveron. And that's probably the largest town in this general area, because there's like a bunch of minor towns and hamlets that's spread out around here, and then a lot of them just lead to this town Graiveron, which is sort of like a local hub in the region. And so it makes sense that this would be the area where the Ukrainians encountered the most resistance, because I'm sure there might have been some sort of local force garrison there. And also, by the time that the Ukrainians reach this region in their advance, because this is about 5 miles or 3 kilometers, I believe, from the border between Russia and Ukraine, by then you probably had a lot of reinforcements being moved in from the neighboring towns like Golovchino, and then just from the Belgorod region in general to stop the attack. And so, in addition, they claimed that they were able to take Goropodol and Glotovo, and so this was actually disputed for a certain period of time, but to me it seems like they may have had a foothold over there. A lot of this is backed up by the fact that residents in the area, they reported that there was gunfire. Specifically in the town of Kozinka, there were reports that within the temple of Apostle and Evangelist John the Theologian, there were up to 30 fighters of the Freedom of Russia Legion. And then that in the wider area of the town of Kozinka, there were about 100 Russian or anti-Putin Russian forces. And so this could include, for instance, the border checkpoint, the Graiveron border checkpoint, which is a facility on the border between Russia and Ukraine. It has several buildings and warehouses, and I'm sure there was some military equipment stored there. And so in that regard, it has significance. And then there's also like the local city council in this area and all the private residential houses. And there's also in towns like Goropodol and Glatovo some warehouses. Like if you zoom in, you can see that there's several facilities over here. They might be farm compounds, or they might just be general storage warehouses. Either way, it's a good area to set up a position or to fortify yourself. There may be some equipment there. There's some ditches to fortify yourself in as well. But in order for this sort of operation to be successful, to actually probe the Russian lines for an extended period of time, which we don't even know if they wanted to do, then you need fire supports. And so on the initial assault onto the Graiveron border checkpoint, the Ukrainians, they did actually have some vehicle support from infantry fighting vehicles. They had a couple dozen they had a couple dozen Ukrainian and American, Polish infantry fighting vehicles that were utilized, and they received some fire support, which was able to suppress the enemies and their fire in the region. And so that was part of why I was successful in the first place. And again, because it is so close to the Ukrainian lines, then it's pretty easy to coordinate all of these attacks. But after a certain point where you push even a couple of miles deeper into Russia, it gets much harder, because the Russians, they acted pretty promptly. There's a lot of criticism of why the Russians didn't immediately react, but given the circumstances before the probing attack, the Russians did respond pretty quickly. You could say that it should have been faster, but again, that's a separate criticism just of the fact that the Russian border guard wasn't prepared originally. But upon the initial attack and the initial breaching of the Russian line, there was a pretty quick response from the Russian battalions in the region in Belgorod. There was also an activation of the local air arsenal. So there were some Su-25s that were airborne and recorded on video, some attack helicopters that were moved into the area. There was videos showing how the Russian columns with the Z symbol, they were moving in from different civilian roads, such as the road from Belgorod into Ukraine. And so they were all linking up in the Graiveron direction, and there was videos showing the BMP-3s as well. And so they were linking up, and that was happening yesterday. And so as a result, within the first 24 hours of the Ukrainians, or you could say the pro-Ukrainian anti-Putin Russian units entering Russia proper, they were finally pushed back. The way that this happened is that the Russians utilized their firepower, whether it be from the attack helicopters or the Su-25s, to attack the Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles, and this caused them to withdraw their equipment from Russia proper back to some safe positions within Ukraine. And so this left the Ukrainian infantry all alone and isolated, and they were outnumbered anyway just because of several battalions closing in on them. And so they saw the writing on the wall, and they just retreated as well, but not before taking up positions within these towns. And according to the Russian sources, they suffered about 40 dead, which, I don't know, that seems like a lot, especially if it's true that it was only 130 that initially entered Russia. 40 would be a huge ratio. It would be like 1/3 of the people that entered died. But given the fact that the Ukrainians were not receiving any sort of cover after the initial retreat of the Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles, it's possible that they were cornered in a certain area and had to fight it out, and many of them died because they weren't receiving enough support. That is certainly possible. Now, these attacks are not just isolated to this one specific area of the Russian-Ukrainian border. According to many sources now, we know that the Kraken Battalion, which is a unit that has fought mainly around Kharkiv and the Luhansk direction, they may have some of their detachments being moved to the border with Russia and Ukraine. And so they are congregating around the city of Vovchansk, which is a key rail hub, which then links into Russia. And so they are planning to basically man the areas around the Russian towns of Novaya, Tavozhanka, of Murom, and of Sareda. And so all these towns, they're pretty small. They're also isolated from one another. There's not many roads linking them together. They're just isolated by different ditches and ponds and open fields. And so if there's not an emphasis on defending each individual town, then they become easy targets for the Ukrainians to pick off one by one. And again, it's being done by a more irregular force, not by the AFU itself, but by one of the battalions that is more organic in nature, not an establishment institution of the Ukrainian military, just the Kraken Battalion, which has acted independently in the past. And so they're probably being delegated this responsibility. Now, there's also some Ukrainian concentrations within other towns around Kharkiv, such as the town of Udi. This is a town, if you could zoom in on, it was previously under Russian control, but now it's a Ukrainian node of just like local military coordination. There's also many other towns around here, like Liptsi, that have military significance around the border. Ternova, as I said before, Vovchansk, maybe one of the more notable examples of this, and also Varinivka, sorry. And so these Ukrainian concentrations, they're nowhere near enough for a general offensive onto Belgorod or any town within Belgorod, but it is enough to defend, first of all, the border, and to conduct these localized probing operations to either create chaos and instill fear into the Russian civilian population, either to divert attention from the Ukrainian retreat and the Ukrainian loss of Bakhmut, and also perhaps for some sort of intelligence gathering, whether it be sort of gauging the strength of the Russian forces in a certain sector along the border in order to see whether it could be penetrated later on. That's also a possibility. But again, regardless of the intentions, we do know the result of this Ukrainian raid. There was some damage incurred, especially to some of the vehicles that the Ukrainians utilized in this operation. So today the Russians, they posted a video outside of the Gray Varon checkpoint, and in it you could see that there are 2 Max Pros that the Russians captured. There's 3 Humvees that were damaged and abandoned by the Ukrainian forces. There's 1 Ukrainian Cross Cobra armored vehicle that was destroyed. There was 1 Polish AMZ JIK-2 infantry mobility vehicle that was destroyed, and there was 1 BTR-82 that was captured, and a pickup truck, I believe, that was destroyed as well. And so all this comes from right outside the checkpoint, which shows that the Russians are back on the official border between the Russians and Ukrainians. But there's no indication that they want to cross that border and attack any sort of Ukrainian towns for the time being. It's not something that they have really done ever since the initial phases of the war. And so, although this entire fiasco really only lasted about 24 hours, it could have some more long-standing implications, because this may force some of Russia's reserves or some of their border guards to be moved to this specific part of the border along Belgorod. So they're diverting forces that may have been sent elsewhere, like maybe to Zaporozhye or to some other part of the front line where Ukraine may actually be conducting a counteroffensive. So it might be a way to sort of divert forces in order to trigger the Russians moving one area, and then the Ukrainians actually conduct their real offensive in a different sector. That's one theory as to what could have happened. Now, another thing to note is that the area that the Russians, the anti-Putin Russians and the Ukrainians chose to launch the assault is located in a very significant area, because their attack is basically adjacent to this river over here, which is called the Vorskla River. I'll actually show you it because it's in blue over here. So this is the Vorskla River, and the Ukrainian advance is directly adjacent to it. And there's also a road, the 14K4 road, which also had the Ukrainian advance. And so if you zoom out a little bit, you can see that this 14K4 road actually leads very close to the city of Belgorod. Look, I'll show you in red. Here is the path. And you can see that it reaches Tomarovka, and then you can take a right and enter Belgorod from the basically the western flank of Belgorod. And so this presents a very good opportunity for the Ukrainians to potentially harass the Belgorod region and the city of Belgorod in the future. Obviously, they don't want to hold on to it entirely. There's this entire talk about Ukraine setting up the Belgorod Republic within the Belgorod region, which is sort of supposed to be ironical, because it's supposed to be the Ukrainian version of the Russian self-proclaimed republics within Donetsk and Luhansk. And so the Ukrainians are trying to create their own within Russia called Belgorod. But that's more of a PR thing. They're not really seriously planning that out. If the Ukrainians were to launch such an operation into Belgorod, it would be in order to gain leverage and to force Russia to the negotiating table, because taking such a large chunk of Russian territory within its pre-2014 borders would be very embarrassing, and it would elicit some questions from the Russian elites, and it could lead them to the negotiating table in order to save face. And so that would be the intention of an operation into Belgorod. And I think that this would be the best area to do it, because this road over here that I haven't read is located in a very, very low elevated area. It's surrounded mainly by forests and higher elevated ridges. There's not many roads in this area that are connected to the main road. So if Ukraine has a swift advance through here, then it's going to be very difficult for Russia to coordinate a counterattack on the flanks. So although it may seem like the Ukrainians would be exposed and if there was any attempt by them to advance along one singular route, it will be difficult for Russia to organize a counterattack on the flanks, just because there aren't many proper roads over here. And if there are roads, then they might be dirt roads or gravel roads, not really these good paved roads for a lot of military equipment. And so all these forests on the flanks, they could also protect the Russians, or the Ukrainians and the anti-Putin Russians as they conduct their advance. And that might be just enough to instill a lot of fear into the Russian public's eyes. And so that would be the plan for the Ukrainians, and it would be aided by the fact that there's a river separating the Russians and the Ukrainians if they were to conduct such an attack. And so they could pretty easily take over this entire polygon area, because it is very isolated. You could see how it could be encircled, and all of the fields in the southern part of this polygon, they're just minefields, and so the Ukrainians would just have to totally circumvent it by taking over Kozhinka, Grayvoron, and all these other towns around here, and then just continue their advance further to the northeast towards Belgorod. Now, Obviously, it's very unlikely that this will happen. If it were to happen, in all likelihood, it would fail unless the Ukrainians moved a very sizable contingent of forces to here. And even if they did that, I'm sure that the Russians would also move a huge contingent into this area. But then this would mean that the Ukrainians would have been able to subvert or divert the Russian forces from their original lines to this new part of the front line. And so we'll see what happens. But again, I would like to remind people that a year ago, when we were talking about this conflict, really nobody would have anticipated that a year later we would see this sort of situation with Ukrainians crossing the Russian border around Belgorod and conducting these raids, and then discussing even the possibility of an offensive into Belgorod. Really shows how the Overton window has shifted in terms of what's considered to be realistic. And so make of that what you will. And that's all for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later.